After more than a year of fighting in the First World War, at the end of 1915, the Central Powers faced a dilemma. German and Austro-Hungarian forces had pushed back the Russian army that summer, while Bulgaria helped them finally crush Serbia in the fall. But the long-term picture was still not good, since the Entente had more resources and more men. Something had to be done, but if the Germans attacked, the French trench systems might stop them, just as they had stopped the French offensives in 1915. If they waited, the Entente's strength in numbers would begin to tell. This was the riddle the chief of the German General Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, tried to solve by launching the Battle of Verdun in February 1916. It would become the longest and most iconic battle of the First World War, but ultimately, Germany would fail. In December 1915, the German High Command debated where they should attack. They could advance in Russia, but the Russians might just retreat again and keep on fighting. They could attack at Salonika, but this front was secondary. The potentially decisive front was the West, and Falkenhayn chose to strike the French at Verdun. Verdun was the most fortified sector of the French line, with an extensive network of forts and supporting works, and formed a dangerous salient. To complicate matters, Falkenhayn believed that a breakthrough in trench warfare was impossible. The German battle plan has long been debated by historians. For decades, most accepted Falkenhayn's post-war memoirs, where he wrote that his intention was to inflict unsustainable losses on France, to bleed the French white. But most historians now argue that the original plan was more likely for Crown Prince Wilhelm's Fifth Army to take the Meuse heights that dominated the city, and possibly even the city itself, in a short, sharp operation. According to this argument, Falkenhayn switched to a strategy of attrition after the initial plan went wrong, and then lied about it after the war. If the Germans eliminated the Verdun salient, it would deal France a major blow and eliminate any threat to German lines and the town of Metz. Even if Verdun didn't fall at first, the Germans atop the heights could rain destruction on any French forces below. In the words of Falkenhayn and Prussian War Minister Adolf Will von Hohenborn, not even a mouse could survive. Beyond that, it's not clear what Falkenhayn had in mind as a strategic goal. Historians debate to what extent he and the other German leaders expected the French to collapse or negotiate after giving up Verdun or sustaining heavy losses in counterattacks. Partly, this expectation was based on many German leaders' ideas of the French national character as hysterical or emotional. It's also possible that Verdun was meant to be the first phase in a larger offensive that would be planned as the first attack was already underway. In early 1916, Crown Prince Ruprecht didn't understand how such a limited offensive could win the war. Falkenhayn isn't clear what he actually wants, and he's waiting for a stroke of good luck which would bring an advantageous solution. He wanted the decision in spring, but explained that a breakthrough was impossible. How else can we force a shift from trench warfare to mobile warfare? Fifth Army Chief of Staff General Constantin Schmidt von Knobelsdorff and other officers wanted to attack on both banks of the river, since only attacking in the east would expose advancing troops to flanking fire. But Falkenhayn decided to attack on the east bank only. There's another historical debate about possible disagreements between Fifth Army and the General Staff. Operation Judgment was to begin February 12, 1916, using as little infantry as possible to save reserves, but supported by overwhelming artillery firepower. French General Headquarters, meanwhile, had decided that Verdun's forts weren't critically important as a siege defense. Belgian, Russian, and Austro-Hungarian forts hadn't done well earlier in the war, so Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre removed many of the Verdun fortified region's artillery and garrisons for use elsewhere, even from important forts like Douaumont and Vaux. Colonel Émile Drian, a local battalion commander and politician, argued in vain for better defenses. In purely military terms, French High Command felt that Verdun didn't have to be held at all costs, or even at all. What it could do was anchor the line as long as it made operational sense. So Germany planned to attack towards Verdun with the goal of removing the salient, but without a clear long-term strategic goal. It seemed the French might not take the bait, but that would change once the battle began. In January 1916, the German Air Force aggressively patrolled the skies above Verdun with 270 aircraft to prevent the 70 available French aircraft from conducting reconnaissance. The Germans brought up 1,250 guns, giving them a 2-to-1 superiority to pound French positions and suppress French batteries with gas shells. German guns would fire 2 million shells in the first week alone. In the area of the attack, the French had about 30,000 men from weak units to oppose the 60,000 Germans who would come in the first waves. Then, winter weather delayed the offensive, and several Alsatian deserters revealed the coming attack, which allowed the French a few days to prepare. Finally, on February 21st, German troops stormed French positions and Operation Judgment began. At first, they advanced cautiously, trying to infiltrate French lines and avoid strong points in an early use of stormtrooper tactics. Colonel Drian's battalion put up a determined defense of the Bois des Corps, which delayed the Germans, but on the 22nd, the wood fell and Drian was killed. Falkenhayn was optimistic. Sehen Sie, mit dem Angriff habe ich mal wieder das Richtige getroffen. See, with the attack, I was right again. Then, on February 25th, German patrols reached Fort Douaumont, the linchpin of the French defenses, but nearly undefended due to a French command and control mistake. The few dozen French gunners present surrendered without a fight. German newspapers trumpeted its capture as a great victory, though several German officers argued for decades over who actually accepted the surrender. By February 28th, the Germans had advanced up to 8 kilometers, but then ran into trouble. Joffre now decided Verdun must be held, and he put General Philippe Pétain's Second Army in charge of the defense. The French rushed in reinforcements and stopped the Germans in their tracks. One of the French soldiers moving up to the front was Dr. Louis Maufray, who witnessed the evacuation of local civilians. In front of us, a long convoy of refugees in carts arrives. It's always the same misery. 1 or 2 horses in the traces, the cows tied at the back, the dog between the wheels. In the cart, suitcases, and on top of them, sacks, oats, hay, and the elderly, the kids, and a tarp covering it all. Most historians think that if Falkenhayn had allotted more infantry divisions to this initial offensive, the Germans could have completely taken the heights on the east bank. But now, the Germans didn't have the numbers, and the French did. Falkenhayn himself began to have doubts, according to Wild von Hohenborn. Falkenhayn is very nervous because of the impasse and heavy losses. Those doubts are not evident to Dr. Maufray, who experienced the power of a German heavy shell hitting his underground first aid post. The shock was terrifying. Those who, like me, were sitting were lifted out of their seats, and those who were standing collapsed. I felt a violent blow to my stomach and head. The lights all went out. The door resonated like a struck gong, and underneath was engulfed by a cloud of dust and burnt gas that seared our throat and nostrils. No one breathed a word. We heard the big chunks of earth raining down on the shelter above us, and then, after a long minute, the noise slackened. So after the dramatic German gains in the first days, they failed to take the eastern heights and found themselves in the very trap Fifth Army had feared. The Germans now held an untenable line. They didn't command all the high ground in the east and hadn't attacked at all in the west, so French artillery on the western heights could rain down devastating fire on the exposed German positions across the river. So the Germans attack on the west bank on March 6th. The French, though, stopped them again, this time on 2 hills that would become infamous for brutal fighting and horrendous conditions: Hill 304 and Moram, Dead Man's Hill. The shelling is so intense that by the end of the battle, Moram is 20 meters lower than at the start. The French High Command decision to hold Verdun was exactly what Falkenhayn later said that he had wanted, but it cost him dearly. Pétain quickly established a defense in depth and improved his desperate logistical situation. Thousands of trucks snaked along the road from Bar-le-Duc that became known as la Voie Sacrée, a lifeline that required constant maintenance by army engineers. This was one of the first instances of mass supply by motor vehicles and a foreshadowing of the motorized Allied armies of 1918. The French also built an extra railway line to supply the front, partly negating the Germans' earlier advantage of a much closer railhead. Pétain also introduced the Noria rotation system, which brought units out of the line before they could be completely destroyed. This meant that about 3/4 of the army saw action at Verdun, including future presidents Charles de Gaulle, Pierre Lebrun, and René Coty. The German Fifth Army, on the other hand, often kept units in the line until they were totally exhausted, with predictable effects on morale. The Noria system was part of the reason why the battle became a propaganda symbol. When it seemed like Verdun might be lost in the first few days, French papers downplayed its importance, but once the line held, the media equated its defense with the national will to resist. Pétain's famous order of the day, "Courage, we will get them," and General Robert Nivelle's "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass, became morale-boosting slogans on the home front. German propaganda found itself in a difficult position as the battle wore on, since the news of a great victory in the early days had raised expectations. Now German papers like the Kriegsecho focused on enemy losses. Our attack is progressing, with difficulty, but irresistibly. Verdun is an immense furnace where the best of France's strength is burning. The paper went on to say, the battle was like a Moloch eating France's children. For the men in the trenches, conditions were unimaginable, as hundreds of guns pulverized the relatively small battlefield. The wet winter mud was turned into a soup and trenches collapsed. The front line was often just whatever shell holes the men could find. This swamp was also strewn with tens of thousands of corpses. French soldier Hervé Lambert wrote home. A couple of lines from the trenches and mass graves where we are. From my squad, there are still 4 of us, out of 9. As to the view I have in front of me, it's overwhelming. Corpses are touching one another, piled up on top of one another, with a smell of decomposing bodies that sticks in your throat. It's horrific, with craters so large you could put a tram in them. I won't say any more. Medical services hardly functioned, and wounded often had to fend for themselves. Drinkable water was in short supply, causing soldiers to take deadly risks. We had to walk 1,000 meters to Fort Douaumont from a ravine. It was raining and mud was everywhere. One passed a water hole from which water was trickling. This corner was where earlier the village of Douaumont had been. But before you got to the water, you had to clamber over dozens of corpses. The French knew about the water source and shelled it regularly. There lay infantrymen, pioneers, all in piles on top of each other. Every one of them wanted water, but got none. So the French managed to stop a second German attack, which led French commanders to conclude the German offensive was over, as little more could be gained by attacking again. But the Germans weren't done yet. In April and May, the fighting raged back and forth, but the lines didn't move much. More and more units on both sides were sent into the inferno, and losses mounted. On May 8th, munitions caught fire and exploded inside Fort Douaumont, killing nearly 700 Germans in an instant. The Germans did inch the lines forward in spite of French counterattacks, and managed to surround the Fort de Vaux in early June. The French garrison was completely cut off for nearly a week. Fort commander Sylvain Raynal later recalled the suffering of his men. Men were overcome with vomiting, for so wretched were they that they had reached the point of drinking their own urine. Some lost consciousness. In the main gallery, a man was licking a small wet streak on the wall. Raynal surrendered the fort on June 7th, 101 days after the Germans had planned to take it. A major German attack on June 23rd made some progress and captured the ruins of the village of Fleury with the help of phosgene gas shells. The battle had raged for months, and the Germans had finally wrestled Morom and Hill 304 from the French, but still hadn't taken the Eastern Heights, a far cry from the initial plan for a swift attack. In early April, Falkenhayn even floated the idea of breaking off the attack. Certainly, it will then be said that we had not won the Battle of Verdun. But that is being said even now, and we can and must accept that. If we win the battle, our chances to end the war very much increase. If we do not win the battle, our final victory will be delayed but not impinged if we decide not to uselessly bite our teeth out at Verdun. On May 8th, he even admitted to the Kaiser that the battle had reached an impasse. Why then, since the Germans had clearly lost several teeth already, did Falkenhayn persist? Fifth Army Command, especially Schmidt von Knobelsdorff, reasoned they could still prevail and avoid the embarrassment of withdrawing. Falkenhayn agreed, partly as a result of wishful thinking and faulty intelligence. German reports wildly overestimated French losses, putting them at 525,000 or even 800,000 killed and wounded to 225,000 German by midsummer. The Germans misunderstood the French rotation system and thought that each new division they saw meant that the one it had replaced had been decimated. Falkenhayn was so confident after the gains of late May and June that he predicted the war would be over by the end of the coming winter. He even lied to Chancellor Bethmann-Hollweg about German casualties. In reality, the French had only lost about 10% more men than the Germans. But German leaders had begun to lose faith in the chief of the General Staff. General Max von Gallwitz sarcastically remarked that at this rate they'd reach Verdun by 1920. Admiral von Müller wrote of the growing doubts in his diary. Great unhappiness with the Kaiser, who doesn't understand the gravity of the situation, and with Falkenhayn, who thinks everything is normal at Verdun. Falkenhayn tried one last offensive in July against the last French strongholds on the eastern heights, but it failed. Berlin removed him in August and replaced him with Paul von Hindenburg, who declared an end to offensive operations at Verdun. So after months of grinding death and the French still holding on to the heights, the Germans gave up at Verdun. But for the French, the battle wasn't over. The French High Command had also made changes. Joffre replaced Pétain with Artillery General Robert Nivelle in May. By late June, Joffre correctly concluded that German offensive strength at Verdun was spent and shifted forces north to the coming offensive on the Somme. For more than 3 months, grinding tactical fighting continued, pushing men like French soldier Marc Boisson beyond their limits. This is not heroism. This is ignominy. What kind of a nation will they make of us tomorrow, these exhausted creatures, emptied of blood, emptied of thought, crushed by superhuman fatigue? Boisson was later killed. German soldiers had it no better, like German-Danish soldier Jeppesen, whose mind played tricks on him at night. Suddenly I saw a monster right in front of me. It was standing and beckoning me to it. I could feel the hairs standing up under my steel helmet. I drew my revolver, flipped the safety off, and crawled forward. But when I got to the monster, it turned out to be one of the small ponies used to pull the carts. It had died here during an explosion and had been raised on its rear. Now all the flesh was peeled from it, and the moonlight shone through the skeleton. Finally, the French were ready to launch a massive counterattack. Heavy rain slowed preparations, but they brought up 650 guns to smash a limited section of German line with 250,000 shells. They also used innovative tactics, faking the start of the attack to get German batteries to reveal their positions and then hitting them with counter-battery fire, putting over 40% of German batteries completely out of action. The new rolling barrage, creeping just in front of the advancing infantry, kicked off the attack on October 23rd. French infantry showed much improved small unit tactics and were better armed with specialized close combat teams and more light machine guns. And the enemy they faced was weak. German troops were miserable, wet, cold, and exhausted from their long stays at the front. French infantry broke deep into German lines and thousands surrendered. French colonial troops recaptured Fleury and Fort Douaumont on October 24th after the German garrison left when 400mm super heavy shells smashed in the roof and started a fire. The French then took the abandoned Fort de Vaux on November 3rd. The attackers overran German William Hermann's unit at night, and as he ran from them, he fell into a large crater. 8 or 10 huge men rose before me, one with a rifle pointed at my head. I was still in a half-kneeling position. I cried, "Pardon, je suis votre prisonnier." Somebody drew back the hand of the man with the gun. I stammered in French, "I don't hate you. I don't hate anyone." And then I collapsed. In a few days, the French captured much of what the Germans had taken months to conquer. Then in December, the French launched a final offensive and pushed back the front line 3 more kilometers to a safer distance from the city. The Germans were just as incapable of stopping it as they were in October, although Generals Nivelle and Charles Mangin developed a reputation for wasting French lives. Verdun was now firmly out of reach for the Germans, if they intended to take it in the first place. Hindenburg drew a pessimistic conclusion at the end of the year. On this occasion, the enemy hoisted us with our own petard. We could only hope that in the coming year he would not repeat the experiment on a greater scale and with equal success. The longest battle of the First World War, the Blutpumpe of Verdun, was over. It had started with a swift German advance and French commanders choosing, as Falkenhayn later said he wanted, to defend the city at all costs. Why then did the German army fail? One problem was the lack of a clear strategic goal. As much debate as there's been about when Falkenhayn did or did not commit to the bleeding France white concept, there's no consensus that he had a clear idea of what this might actually achieve in practice, and his secretive communication style left others in the dark. He seems to have hoped France would collapse if he applied enough pressure. While French losses were higher in the early phases of the battle, the final casualty count was 377,000 killed and wounded for the French and 335,000 for the Germans. Terrible losses, but not enough to knock France out of the war. The Germans also overestimated their own abilities, especially the supposed superiority of their troops compared to the French, and they underestimated French resolve, skill, and strength. As the initial plan failed and the battle dragged on, the German High Command proved all too willing to believe unrealistic casualty estimates of French losses, since it confirmed their bias that they were winning the battle of attrition. Operationally, the chances of taking the heights quickly disappeared within the first week, since Falkenhayn didn't have enough infantry to push through French reinforcements. Falkenhayn himself also admitted after the war that not attacking on the West Bank from the start was a mistake. Potential differences between the General Staff and Fifth Army, if they existed, would not have helped matters. Crown Prince Ruprecht even pronounced the battle lost on March 20th. After a lovely early success, everything bogged down, and the operation so much as failed. Verdun can be considered from February to August to have been a tactical success for Germany, and from then to December, a tactical success for France. But it was a strategic German defeat and, arguably, a French defensive victory. France didn't collapse, and though weakened, still attacked on the Somme alongside the British and held the majority of the line on the Western Front. The German army wasted valuable reserves and fought a costly 10-month battle its leadership planned to avoid. Falkenhayn hadn't consulted the Austro-Hungarians in advance, so they didn't undertake any supporting attacks and eventually needed help to stop the Brusilov offensive. At the end of 1916, Germany's strategic position was worse than it was before Verdun. Verdun also left a lasting legacy after the war. It came to represent the worst of trench warfare and the suffering of the soldiers in the minds of millions, and for many, the cruel futility of the First World War. French Lieutenant de Maisonneuve worried about the future. This war has marked us for generations. It has left its imprint upon our souls. All those inflamed nights of Verdun we shall rediscover one day in the eyes of our children. For many others in France, it became a symbol of the unbreakable national will to resist German invasion, to not let them pass. The battlefield is now littered with monuments, memorials, and cemeteries, and literature and film have turned to Verdun time and time again in the past century. After World War II, it even became a place of reconciliation between France and Germany. In December 1916, though, all that was in the distant future. Nivelle's successes at Verdun caused Paris to make him the new commander-in-chief. He was convinced that he had solved the riddle of trench warfare and determined to win the war in spring 1917. The Battle of Verdun is often viewed as the iconic battle of the First World War, which exemplifies the suffering of men in industrialized warfare. The war itself caused historic social changes and dramatically altered the map of Europe after it was over. Fans of alternate history often like to ponder how it could have ended differently or even been avoided in the first place, and grand strategy games are a popular way to play out your own version of world history. Gilded Destiny is a new and upcoming grand strategy game that wants to innovate the genre. Let's say you find yourself in a comparable situation like the Battle of Verdun, or maybe the Crimean War or Franco-Prussian War. One that requires military prowess, sure, but the scale of warfare will also affect your economy and can even cause social problems down the line. In Gilded Destiny, warfare is not just a progress bar. You're free to intervene and issue commands directly to units. Terrain and logistics will affect them, while large-scale issues such as wounded veterans and trade disruption will challenge you with the social as well as the tactical impacts of warfare. Can you keep your economy running and your supply chains intact? Can you keep the various groups of your society under control as new ideologies rise and rapid transformation leaves some of them behind? If you want to put yourself into the shoes of a leader during the Industrial Revolution on a massive 1.6 million tile map, check out Gilded Destiny. Right now their Kickstarter campaign is running, which gives you access to the game's upcoming alpha and offers the base game at a discounted price. For your support, you can also get a few goodies like the Greater Austria-German Unification Medal, which should give every connoisseur of the German War of 1866 a good chuckle. You can also help the developers by wishlisting the game on Steam. We want to thank Aquila Interactive for sponsoring this video. As usual, you can find all the sources for this episode in the video description. If you're watching this video on Patreon or Nebula, thank you so much for the support. Check out our video on the Brusilov offensive for more on the Eastern Front's biggest battle of 1916. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real Time History, the only history channel that will not let them pass.